In this mini lecture, I'm going to be telling you about the psychology of ineffective altruism. Now, the first thing that has to be said is that people are surprisingly generous. So, globally, if you look across all the different countries in the world, global giving is somewhere around 500 billion pounds per year. 500 billion pounds. That's an pretty much unimaginably huge number. So, how much is 500 billion pounds? Well, it's estimated that it would cost around 70 to 90 billion pounds to completely eradicate malaria from the face of the globe. It is estimated that it would cost somewhere between 8 and 200 billion pounds, a wide range of estimates, but probably somewhere in here, to end world hunger. And it's estimated that it would cost somewhere around 170 to 300 billion pounds per year to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by about 2/3. So we could do a lot with 500 billion pounds if it were channeled in a particularly effective way. Now, as budding psychologists, you might have two different questions on your mind when I tell you about this. So the first question is, why are we altruistic at all? Why are people so generous? We're going to see that evolutionary theory seems to suggest that people should be very selfish. So why is it that they nonetheless donate all of this money to charity? There is, however, a second puzzle, which is, okay, so people are generous, but at the same time, we've seen that they give all this money to charity that could be used to solve these really drastic global problems. But those problems still exist and have, in fact, not been solved through charitable giving. So it's natural to wonder why these donations don't seem to be channeled in the most efficient or most effective possible ways. So we're going to look at both of these questions in this presentation. So I want to dig in a little bit more to this claim that I made earlier that evolutionary theory makes it kind of puzzling that people should be so generous. So you might recognize this man here. This is Charles Darwin, who used to be on the 10-pound note and is quite possibly the most important scientist ever. Darwin, of course, is most famous for his theory of evolution by natural selection, which says that all of the animal species that we see today came to exist because their ancestors were successful at surviving until reproductive age and then successful in having offspring. So because of this pressure to reproduce, animals are not typically particularly nice to each other. In fact, animals are known for eating one another and for competing for their share of a fixed pool of resources. The poet Tennyson described this as nature red in tooth and claw. In other words, nature is a pretty nasty place. To see this more concretely, imagine that there are two different populations within an animal species. One of these populations is filled with nice guys who are very kind to each other and give each other lots of resources and are totally selfless, don't worry about themselves, just try to maximize the greater good. And then you have this other smaller population that's filled with selfish jerks who just take advantage of all the nice guys. Well, what's going to happen? Well, it's not hard to see that the jerks are going to outcompete the nice guys. The jerks are going to take advantage of the nice guys, hog all the resources, and you're going to see this population of nice guys decline over time. And eventually, there won't be any nice guys left at all. You'll just have a population filled with jerks. So this is kind of the most basic prediction that you might make based on evolutionary theory, is that all animals should be jerks. And this works, reasonably well to a first approximation for some species, but for humans, as I suggested, actually are relatively nice to each other, at least compared to a lot of animal species. So why is that? Where is the room for altruism in evolutionary theory? There are three main mechanisms that biologists have worked out since Darwin's time. So the first of these mechanisms is something called kin selection. So kin selection starts with the observation that natural selection operates at the gene level. So genes that manage to make copies of themselves are more prone to survive than genes that don't. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that individuals are selfish. What matters is that the genes are selfish, in the phrase of Richard Dawkins. So that means that actually, if your genes can benefit from sacrificing you by creating more copies of themselves, then they very well may do that. And in this kin selection mechanism, what happens is that people are willing to be altruistic toward people who share their genetic material. So, for example, parents share 50% of their genes with their children, siblings share 50% of their genes with each other, grandparents and grandchildren share 25% of their genes, cousins share an eighth of their genes, and so forth. So, therefore, your genes can actually benefit in the sense that they will promote the existence of more copies of themselves if they are generous toward people in proportion to how much genetic material they share. And this seems to kind of track our intuition. So parents and children have these very tight bonds. There seems to be quite a lot of parental sacrifice toward children. Siblings are very prone to helping each other, maybe cousins a little bit less so. So the biologist Haldane summarized this theory of kin selection as follows. Would I lay down my life to save my brother? No, but I would to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins. All right, so that's the first mechanism that biologists have worked out, but it's not the only one because, of course, people don't only help out members of their family, they also are willing to help out their friends. But you're not particularly more likely to share genetic material with your friends than with other random people, so kin selection doesn't seem like a great explanation for that. So instead, we have this idea of reciprocal altruism. So imagine 2 people living in the same community, A and B. So A helps B, say, shovel snow out of their driveway or something like that, with the expectation that on a future occasion, B is going to help A with something else, either with shoveling their driveway or mowing their lawn when it comes to be summertime or whatever. And reciprocal altruism is actually really a good system because we often have access to different resources and often have access to resources at different times. For example, maybe neighbor A has a snowblower and neighbor B doesn't, so it's just a lot easier for neighbor A to help out neighbor B with the snowblower, but maybe neighbor B has a lawnmower and neighbor A doesn't. So because of these kinds of things, reciprocal altruism can actually be very efficient. But reciprocal altruism can also be risky because there's a possibility of exploitation or free riding. So maybe neighbor A helps neighbor B, and then come summertime, neighbor B decides, you know what, that's okay, I don't really need to help you after all. And one safeguard against this is the idea that, okay, well, maybe you get to do that once, but after a long enough period of time, after I keep getting screwed over by you and you keep not helping me, I'm going to stop helping you eventually. And so this last idea can be kind of generalized. So a person who doesn't engage in cooperative behavior will eventually come to have a bad reputation. And this is true both in these kinds of reciprocal situations where there's just 2 different people, so one person has a negative view of the other person's reputation, for example. But we can also see this more broadly. So if a third neighbor, neighbor C, sees this stuff going on, the neighbor C is also going to infer that, okay, well, maybe this neighbor B person isn't going to be somebody who I should trust. So maybe neighbor C isn't going to offer to help neighbor B out either. So this idea of reputation signaling takes as a starting point this idea that humans are kind of special. We're a social species, much more so than almost any other species of animal. And so our survival really depends on our ability to cooperate with other people. But we only cooperate with people who we consider trustworthy. You might be willing to give a try to helping out somebody or engaging in a cooperative project with somebody who you don't know very well, but eventually, if that person continues to be uncooperative, you're going to find out, and moreover, other people are also going to find out. So, the interesting thing about reputation signaling is that this means that if I go out and I help other people in a way that's visible, then the other people who see me helping are going to make the inference that I'm actually a trustworthy and cooperative person. And that means that helping those other people actually helps me. helping helped the helper. And by the way, this idea of reputation signaling is really just the same as the idea of branding in marketing. So companies jealously guard their reputation by defending their brands and making sure the customers perceive their brands as trustworthy and having a consistent experience that they deliver to customers. So those are the three mechanisms, and the one that seems to apply the most clearly to charity donations is this third reputation signaling mechanism. And there's actually quite a lot of evidence that reputation signaling motives are powerful in the context of charity. So a bunch of economists have studied this in particular, and they found that donations to public organizations like symphonies or universities, they're pretty rarely anonymous, which seems to suggest that the donors want people to know that they were, in fact, donating. Moreover, donors often will give the minimum to be publicly listed in a particular category of donation size. So, for example, these kinds of organizations will often say, okay, well, here's a list of people who donated up to £1,000. Here's some people who donated between £1,000 and £5,000, and so forth. So a person might donate, say, £1,001 so that they can be listed in that second category rather than the first category, because that shows just how generous they are without actually costing them any more money. There's also evidence that environmentally conscious behaviors are motivated by status. So, for example, people are more likely to recycle or choose eco-friendly products if they're being observed by third parties than if they're by themselves. And then there's finally evidence that people are less generous when they think that other people are going to see their motives as being selfish. Okay, time now to move on to the second puzzle. So we've pretty much seen that evolutionary theory at first seems to suggest that people shouldn't be very generous, but then actually it kind of carves out these exceptions, and there do seem to be some reasons why we can be generous, why actually it can benefit individuals to be generous given these mechanisms of kin selection, reciprocal altruism, and reputation signaling. But this still leads to a further question, which is, why aren't we more effectively altruistic? Shouldn't helping the most people possible actually be something that would help our reputations? So the first pass answer to this question is given by philosophers and philanthropists who are members of something called the effective altruism movement. This is a group of people who are devoted to solving world problems by trying to channel resources more effectively. Now, because there's so much money at stake and so much good that can be done with all of this money, I think it may be fair to term the following as the £500 billion question. Does doing the most good look the most good? So effective altruists are all about doing the most good. I was arguing earlier that evolution has kind of made us to want to look the most good. So if it turns out that doing the most good also makes us look the most good, then that's awesome. On the other hand, if this isn't the case, then this might be something that's useful for understanding why many donations don't seem to be channeled in particularly effective ways. I want to talk about three problems with effective altruism from a psychological perspective. So the first one is something that I've worked on myself in my own research, and just as an aside, one of the things that's really cool about going to a research university for undergraduate studies is that often your professors are experts in the topics that they are lecturing on, and maybe even have published papers on those particular topics. So in this case, this is based on some of my own research. And basically what we did in these studies was just asked people to read about different people giving donations, and we told people how much money these people donated, and we told them what the benefits of these donations were. So for example, Julia decided to make a donation of either $20 or $200 or $2,000 to a charity that's focused on international health. And then we tell people that that donation is either used to cure 1 child or 10 children's blindness in Ethiopia. So the question is, which of these things matters more to Julia's reputation? The amount of money that she donated, or how many children she helped? And what we find is it actually seems to be only the amount of money that she donated that matters. So on these charts, the left set of this plot is a question about Julia's moral character. And along the horizontal axis, this is saying, okay, was the personal cost that you took $2,200 or $2,000, was that low, medium, or high? And you can see that there's this kind of a very clear pattern where people tend to think that Julia has better moral character the higher that the cost was that she took. Same thing basically for praiseworthiness over on the right. So people think that Julia was more praiseworthy when she donated a lot of money. Now the green lines and the red lines are whether Julia helped one child or 10 children. And you can see that those lines sit almost right on top of each other. People just do not care how many children Julia helped. Her reputation is served by donating a lot of money rather than a little bit of money. It really doesn't matter how much good she does with that money. So this is kind of bad news for effective altruism, which is saying, let's not focus so much on the costs, let's focus on the benefits and try to maximize how much good we're doing for the amount of money that we are donating. This says actually people don't really tend to care that much about the benefits when they're evaluating people's donations. The second problem is that when other people are evaluating our reputations, those evaluations depend on the perceived emotional investment that I, as the donor, am putting in. So sometimes this is fine, but in other situations this is going to cause problems. So let's consider the following decision. So this guy, Gordon, is trying to figure out how he's going to do the most good. Well, one option is he could donate some time. So Gordon could take a week off, help to build some houses in some far-off country, and maybe if he does that, he's going to roof, say, 1/10 of a house. Because Gordon, of course, is an investment banker. He's not particularly good at roofing. He's really good at investing money, and he would be paid a lot of money for that week that he took off. Now let's consider the other possibility. Gordon could instead give 1 week's worth of his salary instead of taking the week off. With that, he could hire a team of carpenters, given how much money he makes at his job, and those carpenters could roof 10 houses. So effective altruists tend to say that, okay, well, what Gordon should do is he should donate money in this case, not time. Like, donating time might seem to suggest that Gordon is more emotionally invested, but donating money is actually the thing that helps people. Yet, what we see in experiments is that people tend to think that people who donate time are better people than people who donate money, even as they may very well recognize that those donations actually are often not that efficient. And by the way, this research was actually done jointly with an undergraduate who is also a co-author on the paper that we are currently publishing on this. And the third problem I want to talk about is that people often think that subjective values are more important than objective measures when they're selecting charities. So if you just ask people to rate, for example, how important it is that the charity I choose reflects my personal tastes or values versus restaurants, versus investments, versus medical treatments, people are much more prone to saying that charities need to reflect personal tastes or values, not investments or medical treatments. Same basic idea when you ask people explicitly about objective measures. They say objective measures aren't that important for charities. They are important for investments or medical treatments or cell phones. And this suggests that when effective altruists say you should be donating in order to maximize the amount of good that you're doing, people may actually just not agree that that's the appropriate goal of charitable donation. They may think that it has more to do with expressing your values than it does with actually helping people. So that's, I think, also quite consistent with this idea of signaling. You're trying to express your values rather than to necessarily solve specific global problems. But nonetheless, we can argue that this is going to be problematic from the perspective of trying to actually solve those problems. So to sum up, what we've seen is that charity potentially has quite a lot of possibility for solving world problems, in part because people are surprisingly generous, and in part because some of these problems are less expensive to solve than you might think. But we've seen that one of the main reasons why people donate is signaling their reputation, and this reputation signaling is equally well served by effective and ineffective giving. And in fact, in some situations, there's actually reputational incentives for giving ineffectively, such as the case of volunteering versus donating money. So psychologists who've done these studies have also tried to think about what are some of the ways that we can reduce these biases or try to help people to make decisions that are more helpful to others. So one technique that seems to work is that making the benefits easier to evaluate and compare across charities does make people pay more attention to benefit information. So there's a website called givewell.org, for example, that tries to estimate the effectiveness of various kinds of charities. Another thing that seems to work is instead of thinking of donations as donations of money, we can equally well think of those as donations of time, because of course, the way that we get money is precisely by selling our time in the form of labor. So thinking of a donation as £500 versus as donating a week's wages, these are going to have different effects on both the way that you think about the donation yourself and potentially the way that you're perceived by other people. And finally, there's evidence that when donors feel a greater sense of personal responsibility for those donations, so when you put people, for example, in a position of more decision-making authority, people are more prone to rely on objective metrics. So if you think about your own charitable activities more as a personal effort that you're making to help specific concrete people, rather than as an expression of your values, it may turn out that you are more prone to making decisions that actually help a larger number of people. So I hope you enjoyed this little dive into the psychology of altruism. If you decide to come to Warwick, there is, of course, a lot more where this came from, and I hope to see each and every one of you in class next year.